Hello and welcome. Today I am going to be presenting a talk that I gave at the recent Complex Anarchism Symposium in Brussels that was on from the 19th to the 23rd of May. The title for the talk was Unifying Value Theory and Cybernetics. If you have any comments on the talk or questions, I will do a Q&A. Just leave the comments and the questions below in the comments on YouTube, or fire me an email or hit me up on Blue Sky. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to subscribe and to like and share to juice that algorithm. And of course, if you want to support the show, you can go to Patreon and throw me a few commie dollar. Or if you want to support the book project, this is using some of the research that we have done for the book. You can go to the classlesssocietyinmotion.com. Okay. So let's start. So the talk is titled Unifying Value Theory and Cybernetics. Okay, so the two main schools in socialist thought, I think it's fair to say, are anarchism and Marxism. Here we got the two beards. We got Bakunin on the left and we got Marx on the right. And these two schools of thought have essentially been split from each other for quite some time now. Okay, and I think it's fair enough to say that if we were to look at anarchism, we would say that its main focus is on perhaps organization, what we might call organization. So this is the ideas of hierarchy and domination and such things. And from the Marxist school, they are heavily influenced, put their focus on economics. Marx's great tome, Capital, Volume 1, 2 and 3, and all the other good stuff such as theories of surplus value. Now, sometimes there's like a lot of back and forth between Marxists and anarchists and disagreement and stuff like that. But I'd like to emphasize is that when it comes to terms of economic theory, the anarchists typically were very copacetic with Marxist economic analysis. Here's a quote from Michael Bakunin. "This work, Das Kapital, will need to be translated into French because nothing that I know of contains an analysis so profound, so luminous, so scientific, so decisive, and if I can express it thus, so merciless an expose on the formation of bourgeois capital and the systemic and cruel exploitation that capital continues exercising over the work of the proletariat." So we see that these two schools, they have a lot in common. They're both, I think, pointing towards a similar type of society where there is no exploitation, there's no domination of the working class by another class. Class of society where the proletariat no longer exists and everybody's a worker and has control over their productive lives. Okay, now if we were to look at the two schools, we would say that the organizational and the economic, right, can be represented by the two scientific fields of value theory, what Bakunin was just talking about, and cybernetics. Value theory can teach us the underlying basis of capitalist production, right? And what socialism has to be if it's not going to be capitalism. And similarly, cybernetics informs us about, the nature of production in socialism, its organizational forms. And as we'll see, it links deeply with the Marxist concept of alienation. Okay, so the two kind of generic ways people think perhaps of anarchism and Marxism is one of economic and one of organization. Well, we've got our sciences here. We have our value theory and our cybernetics. Okay, and what we want to do is try and, over this lecture, is to show how intertwined these two fields are and how there is an actual synthesis to be had between these, which I think has a lot to say about how we can hope to reunite these two estranged schools of socialist thought, that we can unify these two. Okay, so first now we got to get into a little bit of cybernetics and explain what the hell I'm talking about. Okay, so this is the book that started the cybernetic revolution off by Norbert Wiener, called Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine. So he defined cybernetics as the scientific study and mathematical modelling of regulation and control in systems. How do systems manage to regulate themselves? How do I as a human manage to regulate myself so that every day I wake up the next day I'm still alive, I'm able to continue as an organism in the world? Or here's another definition of cybernetics. Because cybernetics is really one of these kind of broad transdisciplinary sciences. So, cybernetics is the transdisciplinary study of circular causal processes such as feedback and recursion, where the effects of a system's outputs return as inputs to that system, influencing subsequent action. So this definition trying to get towards this idea of feedback and recursion and how the system acts in the real world and its actions in the real world act back on itself, and how does it manage to maintain itself through all this fantastic complexity. Now, the basic fundamental concept in cybernetics is this notion of variety. It's a very, very simple concept, but it has amazingly profound implications, like any kind of good scientific abstraction. Okay, here's a definition of variety. Variety is a measure of the complexity of a system, the number of distinct states that a system can have. Okay, so here is a backgammon board. Now, if we want to think about what is the variety of a backgammon board, well, you've got 15 red and white checkers and you've got 24 positions on the board. Now, in backgammon, there is actually 18 quintillion possible legal positions on a board. Okay, so that would be a measure of the complexity of this game, which again with very simple structure, only a few little white and black blots on our board here, but it has an incredible amount of variety, complexity in it. And then we have this secondary concept, fundamental concept, which is requisite variety. Just a very related concept. And so we have a definition here. For a system to survive, it must have the ability to absorb the variety or chaos of its environment, make sense of it, and be able to respond in an appropriate manner. Okay, so, I want to cross the road. I have to have, eyes and ears, skin that can feel the wind. I can see the reflections on the cars. I need to have an understanding of the motion of cars to be able to get across the road safely. If I'm a 2-year-old child, I won't have that. I won't have the awareness. I will not have the requisite variety to navigate the road system. Okay, so building upon these two kind of core concepts of variety and requisite variety, Stafford Beer built this model called the viable system model. And this is a kind of a model which describes how systems manage to structure themselves so that they're able to survive in the world. Okay, so there are kind of 5 subsystems. Let's have a look here. Taking the human body as a system to observe, well, we have our system ones. These would be like your organs, like your lungs and your heart, your skin, stuff like that are just churning away doing their work, right? Automatically. We don't need to tell our heart to beat or our lungs to do it. They're essentially pretty independent. They work work away by themselves. Secondary, then we have the system 2, which is like a communication system. This, in the case of the body, is the spinal cord. And then we have the lower management functions. This is system 3, the lower brainstem. So systems 1, 2, and 3 together, we can identify with the ancient brain, so like our lizard brain or whatever. I'm not a neurologist, so I could be getting this wrong. And the autonomic nervous system. Okay. Now then system 4, we have basically our planning function. This is our eyes and our ears, seeing out into the environment. Our frontal and prefrontal cortex, parts of the brain to do with cognition and conversation. And finally, we have the conscious mind, which is dealing with introspection and decision making. Now, in the case, you can apply this to any system. So in the case, say, of a corporation, in capitalism, we'll say, well, system 1 might be the coalface operations, depending on your business, whatever that is. If it's McDonald's, it's the people serving the people at the front and cooking the food, okay. Then we have our communications. We'll have communications within the firm, between the different, say, units and upwards and downwards. We have our local management, maybe our local manager in our McDonald's. Then we have corporate planning. So that would be trying to look out to the environment, perhaps seeing, what type of new burger or wrap should we be thinking of? We have changes in taste and we've got to meet our needs of our customer going forward. And finally, we'd have our board of directors and they'll be making the executive decisions. Okay. So that's the basic structure of the VSM. Now, we can see from our body or from a corporation or any system that you want to look at hierarchy is absolutely fundamental. There is a hierarchical structure in each system. And this is a result of how systems have to be designed to be able to cope with the variety in their environments. Okay, most of the time, the corporation headquarters or your conscious brain doesn't need to know what's happening with the chip fryer or what's going on in your lungs. But sometimes they may need to. For example, if I want to go swimming and I'm going underwater, I need to make an executive decision to tell my body, do not breathe in when we're underwater. Okay? So hierarchy is absolutely fundamental in the ability to attenuate variety in the environment. And it's not just within a single system, you see. In a single system, like a person working on the frying machine in McDonald's, they themselves have a hierarchy within their own bodily structure. But larger systems, okay, are nested. They have recursions, so systems of systems, okay, and a hierarchical structure. So if we take McDonald's, it's the person working on the chipper, maybe they have their manager in the shop, and then they might have corporate managers all the way till you get to the executives on the board. Okay, and similarly in our bodies, right? Our actual system ones, like our lungs, are actually a viable system all of their own within their environment, which is our cavity of our chest, and then below that, you end up getting smaller and smaller systems, nested systems within the lung structure, blood vessels, etc., etc. So it's not purely that hierarchy is built into the individual system, but larger systems tend to be nested systems, collections of nested systems. And complex systems manage to propagate themselves over time through their environments. They manage to survive by allowing the subsystems to self-organize as they see fit, with only intervention where necessary. So we get this kind of fractal-like structure. Delegation of responsibility is the rule, and things are only ever intervened when necessary to maintain system integrity. Okay, so in the case of me swimming, my System 5 will interfere with the operation of my lungs, which themselves are a system, and tell them not to operate and not to breathe in. Because if they do, I die, I drown, and I don't want that. Now, another kind of core aspect of cybernetics is the concept of algedonics, and these are pain and pleasure signals. These pain and pleasure signals allow things to jump up through the hierarchy for help. Okay, so let's have a look here. So the idea of algedonics is that and of the higher order systems, like nested systems, is that what goes on in the recursion below, the higher recursions are unable to know exactly what's going on there to give explicit directions. So what they do is they condition with an input, and the lower systems are essentially black boxes to the higher systems, that we try to change the behavior of them via this use of pain and pleasure signals, algedonics. Okay, so let's have a look here at a simple example of algedonics and how this is how the higher systems will train or manage to get the desired effect from lower systems. So take the example of a dog trainer and a dog. Okay, the algedonic here would be a pleasure signal of a reward of a little dog, a doggy biscuit. Okay, now the trainer does not know what it is he would have to do to change the dog's neuronal structure to get it to, say, heel or give him his paw. He has no idea how to do that, right? It's beyond his scope. But what he is able to do is to elicit that behavior from the dog by giving it a reward or not. And just with this simple method, this algedonic to the dog, it's able to change the dog's behavior without any notion of how it's doing. The dog itself changes its behavior. The algedonic is able to condition the lower ones, but the lower systems self-organize So the trainer gets his desired result. He gets the dog to give him his paw. He gets the dog to heel. He gets the dog to roll over and tickle, and so he can tickle its belly, right? Without having to actually interfere in the actual structure directly of the dog. The dog actually self-organizes. The dog solves the problem about how to do this. And the algedonic is the method through which the dog is conditioned. We see similar thing in the potty training. You know, you might train your kid not to wee on the carpet when they're first not to wear a nappy, and maybe you'll give them praise when they do it right, or you might say, "Oh no, that's not good," when they wee on the curtain. I just want to bring this back now to, say, the Complex Anarchism Symposium. Here is a quote from the main brochure for the symposium, and it says here that anarchy. I'll read this quote here. Anarchy, despite its popular definition as a state of disorder, is rather a mode of being where we organise ourselves voluntarily, that is, without coercion from a central controller or hierarchical system. So let's just deal with this here, because what we've actually seen is that hierarchy is actually fundamental to the structure of systems. Okay? And sometimes the central controller will have, a coercive control. Take for example the case of swimming. My conscious brain tells my lower order systems to stop breathing when I'm underwater. It gives an order. It coerces it to stop. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with that coercion. Now, if we look at, say, the example of a child getting beaten with a cane, we have a hierarchy. We've got the teacher, and we got the kid, and the kid's going to get, 6 lashes, 6 of the best, and a strange expression. And here we have a hierarchy, a hierarchical system as well, and we have coercion. So, I think we need to be very careful in how we distinguish stuff. Because, hierarchy is not the problem. Because hierarchy is a scientific, systemic necessity. The problem is these relations of domination, that the teacher has the right to hit the child. We need to delineate between what types of coercive behavior, like my conscious brain telling my lungs not to breathe when I go swimming, and we have these kind of social domination. And this is extremely important, because this whole focus on hierarchy in anarchism, I think, is scientifically misguided. We need to delineate between hierarchy and these domination relations, these social relations of domination. Okay. And, I think classically anarchists were aware of this. I think if you talk to run-of-the-mill anarchists, the stereotype of an anarchist, it will be about a hierarchy. But if we look towards, here's an example, this is from the Central Organization of Workers in Sweden. These were an anarchist federation, and you can see that they had these structures. And we see the same in the syndicalists in Spain. They had these hierarchical structures. So they obviously knew that they had to have hierarchy to be able to manage things. So we really need to be very clear when we talk about hierarchy, as in, because hierarchy itself is not the problem, it's the social relations. It's the social relations of domination within a hierarchy. Okay, that was a lot of cybernetics. Okay, we've done a cybernetic dump on you there. Okay, now we're going to go to the kind of Marxist side, the value theory. Now, main question Marx starts off with in Capital is trying to figure out what gives a commodity its value. Why is this bag of sugar worth £2 and not £27? Okay, and Marx came up with the answer that, and this was absolutely, mainstream economics at the time, the classical political school, they had the labour theory of value. So when Marx came along and he said, the value of that product is from the labour of the workers, this was a completely uncontroversial take. But it's a little bit more complex than that. It's not just the labour of the workers, it's also the kind of dead labour, that's sitting in the machines that is transferred into the product bit by bit over its lifetime. So it's a combination of the living labour of the workers and the dead labour that's contained in the capital stock. The machines, the buildings, or whatever. So Marx also solves this problem, like how to explain like what Ricardo called the residual. If a business pays the workers the value of their, and in what they would call the value of their labor, and if they pay the proper value of all the inputs into their product, so the raw materials, the machines and everything, where does profit spring from? Where does it come from? If we pay the full value of all the inputs, all of a sudden that there's this extra profit that appears ex nihilo. And Marx came along and showed how basically it was from exploitation. So Marx had an exploitation theory of profit. Okay, and so the workers were paid, and Marx's deep insight was by understanding that workers aren't paid the value of their labor. Okay, that actually what workers are paid for is the value of their labor power. This is a completely new concept that Marx introduced into political economy. And labor power is the ability to do work. Labor itself is the measure of the value of the thing. So the value of an object is how much labor time has been put into it. When a worker, say, goes working for 12 hours, what Marx said is that actually in 4 hours they produce the amount of goods that are equal to the wages that they're paid for the entire 12 hours. And for the remaining 8 hours, they do what's called surplus labor time. And so this product that gets created in the 8 hours goes directly to the capitalist. So the capitalist is basically skiving off, in this example, 2/3 of all the value. And that is the surplus labor time is basically the profit. So what we have then is the value of the commodity is equal to the dead labor plus the living labor in it. And in other terms, Marx breaks this down. He says it into the constant capital and the variable capital, and also the surplus value. So the constant capital is equivalent to the dead labor, the machines, the buildings, whatever, raw materials. The variable capital then is the money, the price of the wages. So the living labor is split into variable capital and surplus value. Okay, so we have this simple equation. The value of the commodity is equal to C plus V plus S. Very, very simple. The constant capital, the machines, raw materials, the variable capital, the wages, and the surplus value, the unpaid work that the worker does. So that is the value of the commodity. We're going to come back to this later. So, and it's not just the value of the commodity is not just the specific labor it took to make that commodity in a given factory. It's the average of all factories that are producing this commodity. It's the average amount of labor that goes into that product. And so Marx calls this the socially necessary labor time. Okay, in our factory, we might produce a shoe in 2 hours of labor on average, but on average in the economy as a whole, it might be 2.5 or 1.5 hours. And at the root in capitalist production, that Marx talked about the alienation of the worker. Okay, so the worker is alienated in the production process. Okay, they're alienated first from the product, right? If I'm working in a factory creating a shoe, or I'm in McDonald's, or wherever it is, I create the shoe, and the shoe goes off, and it's the shoe is alienated from me. It goes off and it's sold for somebody else. I'm not creating it for myself. We're also alienated from the process. Okay, we don't have control over the process. We are usually dictated about how to do the work. We don't organize it for ourselves. This alienation from the work process. And we're also alienated from the people which we do the work with. So capitalism tends to pit workers against each other. Workers get different pay rates. They're competing. You don't know what each other's wage is. They may offer bonuses, year-end bonuses, or it might be even piecework. And this tends to pit the workers against each other. And finally then, it alienates people from what Marx called their species being. And this is like the innate desire for people for creative and problem-solving work. That under capitalism, people become disconnected from their essence as free and conscious creators. And all of this, of course, is based on private property relations. We've got a capitalist who owns the firm, We've got a shop owner who owns a shop if you're working for them, and so on and so on. And these firms, they individually reproduce themselves. Each firm has to make enough profits for themselves to survive. Okay, so they're reproducing themselves individually, reproducing their own private property. And in capitalism, the labour is indirectly social. So when you're producing a commodity to sell into the market, you do not know whether the labour that's going into producing this shoe is actually desired by society. We only find out post-production through the validation you receive through selling in the market, whether your work to create this shoe was actually socially required, it was socially valid, or whether it was a waste of time and no one wants it. And in that exchange, when that shoe is bought, in that purchase, in that market exchange, there is a realization of surplus value. At that moment, the owner gets their profit. And this is fundamental, okay? That in market exchange, underlying this it's like a validation of exploited labour that has been performed already. And in capitalism, we have money. And money is an expression of these private property relations. Okay? We've got private producers, right? They're producing their goods independently. And they may not even know how much labour has gone into producing their product explicitly. They may know their costs, right? But they may not record everything in labour hours. Okay? And neither do their competitors. And even though the value of the good is determined by their labour time, this doesn't get expressed directly in capitalism because they don't record it in labour time terms. And competing firms have an interest in not telling. Even if they did know, they would have an interest in not letting their competitor know what their actual labour content of their product was. So in a system where private property is the basis for production, money is required for it to function. Okay? It's an expression of the private property relations of production. And capitalism has all other manner of things going on in it. Okay? We have the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. Here's a graphic taken, I think, from a book of Michael Roberts showing historical rate of profit calculations going back to 1869. I think this is the world rate of profit for I think the top 19 economies or 15 capitalist economies. And we see that it used to be 45% and now it's gone way down below 20%. And what drives this falling rate of profit? Well, there's this tendency built into capitalism, built into the capitalist social relations of production, whereby each individual producer always wants to automate away the work, okay, replace the workers with machines that will do the job quicker and cheaper. And if they're able to produce it cheaper, they'll be able to get more profit. It's in the individual interest of the producer to automate. But this advantage is short term. And their competitors will react and usually copy the types of machinery or innovate themselves. So over the long haul, while in the short haul your profit rate will be increased, if everybody introduces these machines, the profit rate reduces because the amount of money that you're outlaying on machinery versus wages becomes bigger over time. The proportion of your capital investment grows in machinery and raw materials, so your constant capital versus your variable capital versus your wage bill. And only living labour can create new value, create surplus value. So the less money that you, as a proportion you spend on wages, the less there is as a total proportion of your outlay will be generating profit for you, surplus value. So over time, your ability to produce profit shrinks and there's nothing you can do about it. You have to innovate to stay alive in capitalism, and if you innovate and if everybody's innovating, it drives down the profit rate. Marx called this, he had a great way of putting it. He said the falling rate, the tendential fall in the rate of profit is merely the expression under capitalist social relations of increases in productivity. He said something like that. I'm paraphrasing. And with the falling rate of profit, you get crises, right? You see that before a crisis, the rate of profit tends to fall. Before the Great Depression, before 2008, all of these crises are linked to the falling rate of profit. Falling rate of profit makes capitalist crises just an inevitability. Now, in capitalism, you have this anarchy of what Marx called the anarchy of the market. Okay, so you have firm A and firm B. Firm A, we're making shoes. They get a new machine to try and outcompete their competitor. At the same time, their competitor is introducing the machine as well. Neither of them know what the other is going to do. And all of a sudden, when they both go to start producing, then there's a glut. There's overproduction. There's overcapacity. And this overcapacity, the labour embodied in these unneeded machines, is a waste from a societal point of view. Within this anarchy between the firms of private property reproduction, there is like this waste dynamic built in. And it's not just, the anarchy is not just this competitive anarchic waste, but there's also this kind of like strategic, like a lack of strategic planning in capitalism, where we see in Engels talks in Socialism, Scientific and Utopian about how when the steam engine arose, the steam engine required a clean water source to drive the mills. And the capitalists would come into a small town in northern England and they would have a good river, a source of clean, fresh water. And they would build their factory and they would produce. And as the small village would grow into a factory town or a city, the water supply would get polluted. And this pollution would then cause problems for the steam engines driving their equipment. And so they would move on to the next small town with a different water source, a fresh water source, and so on and so forth. And in this haphazard manner, capitalism went through and destroyed these environments and built up these towns and then fled them, leaving them to ruin. This type of anarchic kind of strategic developmental planning in capitalism is embedded. We see here, this is Jeff Goldblum from Jurassic Park, where life finds a way, but what we're seeing here is value finds a way. Look at what happened, say, with the falling rate of profit in the West in the 1970s. What happened? Production fled to low-wage markets. Why did it go there? It did not go there because of the evilness or the anti-American or anti-British nature of their own bourgeoisie. It went because of these objective material facts that the rate of profit was low. And so value went and moved towards a high profit, high exploitation location, such as China. And value will do what it needs to reproduce itself. When the falling rate of profit starts hitting in China, we will see it move out of China. We're already seeing elements of that. As the wages in China are starting to rise, we're seeing capital flow towards places like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. And all of capitalism rests upon what Marx would call a primitive or primary accumulation. That for workers to work in these alienating factories, these jobs that are soul-destroying jobs, they would only do that if they didn't have the means to reproduce themselves for themselves, if they weren't self-sufficient. And so capitalism had this long period of primitive accumulation, primary accumulation. And it was in different places this took different forms. Okay, we see this in the Highland clearances in Scotland, or the slave trade in Africa, or the Irish famine, so on and so forth. Everywhere there was a dispossession of the common lands to deprive them the ability to reproduce themselves, to drive them into factories. Now, value theory is an amazing scientific achievement, right? It unmasks this kind of hidden domination that's involved in the wage contract in capitalism, where it's hidden between this like free, inverted commas, contract that the worker enters into with their employer. What Marx managed to do was to unmask actually the inequality, the unequal power dynamics between the worker and the capitalist. And this is what allows the capitalist to exploit the worker. The worker has to take a wage if they're going to survive. And what before in feudalism was straightforward an exploitation relationship. You worked for the feudal landlord. 60 days a year, or gave him a quarter of your produce, your own personal corn or whatever. And that it was direct. You saw this exploitation relationship. And in capitalism, it's masked and obfuscated behind this wage relation. And so, taking this all of Marx's critique of capitalism together, we start to get an idea for what communism must be. The capital, Das Kapital, Marx's analysis gives us a kind of a negative, a photographic negative of what socialism is. Okay, now let's move on to modern production. We'll see how cybernetics and value theory, this kind of analysis of social relations of production, how we see how a synthesis is starting to evolve out of modern production. And so the kind of high watermark of kind of cybernetic production in capitalism is the Toyota production system. This was invented by Taiichi Ohno across over a couple of decades in the post-war period in Japan. And they had a particular problem that they needed to solve. That they could not compete with the mass production of the Ford and the American big major producers. And what they needed to do was figure out some other way that they could do it and not rely on mass scale. The Fordist method, where we see here an assembly line from the 1920s, I think, making the Model T Ford. These are massive giant factories where a car would flow in and it would be assembled on this line and move from one station to the next. And each worker, basically, the production was basically organised on Taylorist lines, whereby the motion of each worker would be analysed to be as efficient as possible, and workers were to be rewarded for their own individual productivity. Now, these were incredibly successful companies. Right, they were producing amazing numbers of cars. Millions and millions and millions of Ford Model Ts were made. But when Taiichi Ohno and these guys went over to Ford, what they actually saw when they walked around these companies was actually waste, as in inventories just piling up everywhere. We see here a picture. This is a picture, I think, of the gas tank of a Model T Ford being produced. And so in Ford, each individual, production line, so if you're producing, engine blocks or gas tanks or whatever they may be, chassis or whatever, these individual things. Now, we're not talking about the assembly line where they're all assembled, but the individual production of the units, components required for the car. Each one of these was optimizing their output. And this makes a lot of individual sense. If you've got machines there that are needed to create an engine block, you want to utilize that machine as much as you possibly can before your competitor comes up with a new machine that will be more productive than this machine. So there's this constant drive to fully utilize machines as quickly as you can. And so each individual, the engine block or the gas canisters or the gas tanks or whatever, each part of these would be optimizing their own individual production. But what that would mean is if they weren't doing it with respect to overall what was needed on the assembly line, that they were basically building up these massive inventories everywhere. And with those inventories come this whole management system for arranging them, stores, warehouses, blah, blah, blah. And when you have these massive inventories, waste just propagates everywhere. Why worry about the quality of the individual, engine block, if you know that if it's faulty, we've got 6,000 in the store and we can just push one in. So by optimizing the individual elements of production, what you ended up doing, that optimization was at the expense of overall efficiency. The factories were essentially like waiting rooms, right? There was just masses of equipment lining up everywhere. And this is kind of intrinsically built into capitalism, this idea of pushing the output out, because you want to push it out to get maximum utilization. Now, what Ohno's genius move was to actually only build towards demand. Okay? And instead of trying to push each individual element working as efficiently as they can do, what actually needs to be done is everybody works at the rate of the slowest element. Okay? Because to do otherwise, we'll just end up with inventories piling up in different places and being wasteful. So if we think of a rowing crew, there is no point in rowers all rowing at their own individual maximum pace. That the actual rhythm of their stroke would interfere with each other, and it actually caused them to slow down and squiggle and go crooked and every type of thing. So in a rowing boat, you actually all row to a strict rhythm, and it'll be the fastest pace which all of you are able to maintain. And this is the basic idea of the TPS. Each individual component in production is the customer. Their customer is their next stage in production, and you only produce as they need it. And this idea of each individual stage in production, that the next one being its customer, that each individual production stage gets essentially what are algorithmic signals. They get algorithmic signals saying produce more, stop, produce more, stop. And each individual production stage is essentially like a black box to the next one. And it is conditioned by these algorithmic pull, stop signals that are coming. So we see this is like each individual is like the dog and the trainer. The next step in production is training the previous step in production with its algorithmic signal saying, I want more, stop producing. I want more, stop producing. These stages, individual stages, do not need to know how the previous step is organised in their production, just that they're able to produce when they're asked. And here we see a picture of, say, the Toyota production line. You see this big long yellow cord to the workers there. And this is called an andon cord. So anytime there's something wrong in the production, they pull this andon cord. And this is like an algorithmic, a pain signal that goes out across the whole production line. And other workers will come and try and solve the problem as it happens. Right? You might get engineers, management, co-workers will try and solve this. The whole line will shut down, which would have been unthinkable in Ford. That would be a sackable offence if the line was going down all the time. In Toyota, this was how they reorganised production onto a higher level. And so the production line, what Ono was aiming for was to trying to get everybody involved in solving the production problems. When you pull the andon cord, your team comes in, you all help try and fix it. Instead of just like the Fordist way where the workers were basically tailors, just very, very alienated work. Here, Ono realised that if this was to work, you would have to have the workers involved in problem solving, that it was absolutely essential. Like, it makes just kind of common sense that it's much better to have 100% of people involved in this discovery process in production, optimizing production, than having maybe 5% of engineers or managers. And what they did at each point was they did what they call lowering the water. So what they did is, at each point in the production stage, they would lower the inventories that were at hand for each of the workers. And over time, like this picture of the river here, where, you know, you might have a shopping trolley sticking up when it becomes a drought and you can see all the flaws and the things that are obstructing stuff. Same with the production process. And so by lowering the inventories, you uncover inefficiencies in the problem, quality problems, and then you fix that, and then you are able to survive then at this lower inventory level. With that, the line becomes much more efficient. You need less inventory sitting everywhere, less management, less capital sitting unused in those inventories. All of this organisation of production by the workers relied on what we like to call cooperative relations of production. They relied on the team, the small team, as the basis of which production should be organised. Okay, the standards that are produced on how to optimally produce in your little section are produced by those team members. And those team members are the only ones who can do it because they are the only ones that are in contact with that physical reality. Bringing back in the cybernetics, the only ones with the requisite variety to optimize production. Nobody else actually has that requisite variety, only those in the work. And here's where we see some really counterintuitive things starting to happen. To get these people working as a team, this required what we might call pseudo-communist relations, whereby on the assembly line, they were all paid the same wages. If each individual person was getting an individual reward, like in the Taylor system, for their work output, they would hoard the best techniques. Why wouldn't you? If your pay is linked to you having been more productive than your workers, you would hoard your technique. So for these techniques to propagate, and for one worker who finds a better way of doing it to get generalized in every Toyota factory in the world, that requires that you de-link people's pay from their own individual productivity. And so we have the workers working, having the same wages as their fellow workers on the line. And what's more, there was also a contradiction that they needed to get over. Why should a worker risk sharing an idea that would improve productivity so much that it might put them out of a job? So we see that Toyota had to introduce what people might call a job guarantee, an income protection. So they say, if you optimize production such that we need less workers on the line, we'll guarantee you to find you a job somewhere else. That they had to protect the workers from the market, from wage labour. They had to basically dampen the wage labour dynamics in capitalism to optimize capitalism. So what we see here is that like cooperative relations of production are vastly superior than competitive relations of production. Okay? That optimization of production, that the cybernetically optimal way to do production is actually fundamentally related to the class dynamics, the social relations of production. We see cybernetics and value theory pointing in the exact same direction for how production should be optimized. And so we see that there's a very, very deep relation between alienation and the cybernetic concept of requisite variety. The production is optimized by less alienated workers who are actually less alienated from the labour process, less alienated from their work colleagues, less alienated from their species being, of them wanting to be effective, problem-solving, creative individuals. So we see, requisite variety and alienation are intertwined, inseparable concepts. We call this the inverse law of alienation. TPS has shown, the Toyota production system has shown, that alienated labour is a fetter on the mode of production, a fetter on capitalist productivity. And yet, capital is fundamentally based on alienated labour. This contradiction is just built into capitalist relations. Okay, it's a system built on alienated labour that optimizes itself by de-alienating labour. And what production actually points towards is what Engels says here. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and the direction of the processes of production. This is what Engels is talking about communism. Okay, instead of things being created to produce value, that actually production is now goes towards the production of things. In this sense, he's talking about the state and the government of persons. And under communism, this would become about the administration of things. But here we can see it, if we think about it in the sense of Taylorism, that the government of persons on the production line, the individual, is replaced by the administration of things, the optimization of the production process based upon cooperative social relations. So finally, let's talk about socialism, communism and anarchism and what all these findings mean. What can they say about what a socialist, a communist or an anarchist society, whatever we want to say, call this new mode of production that capitalism is pointing us towards? What can we deduce about it scientifically from what we've been talking about today? Well, capitalism is a class society. One crowd owns, the other crowd works for a living. So communism by definition must be a class society. And this abolition of classes implies an abolition of unearned incomes. So no exploitation, no usury, no private rents. And all of this relies on a primitive communist accumulation or a primary accumulation. Not a capitalist primary accumulation, but a communist one. Here's this cool t-shirt. I have a t-shirt of this one. It's like, get in loser, we're seizing the means of production. This would require, a communist society would require the proletariat to seize ownership of all of the assets, of all the productive assets in society. And Marx calls this the first negation. This is the first thing you need to do. And no longer production will be based on the alienated labour of wage labour, but on the self-organisation of production by the workers themselves. Not a state, not a capitalist, but the workers themselves organising production. But this ending of alienated labour would be a process. This is not an immediate thing. We would inherit machines that would be built with class relations built into them. Some of the work would be boring and repetitive and mind-numbing. So there would still be alienated labour, but communism would be a process of washing this out. And this has big implications for what the distribution relations are in communism. We might like everything to be free to consume in communism after we win the revolution. But if workers still have to do lots of alienated labour, as they would do, to reproduce society with the given means of production that we have, that we inherit from capitalism, that would mean if everything was for free, if there was no link between production, the work you do, and how much you get to consume, that would mean there'd be those that do not work, that would be living their lives on the back of the alienated workers who are producing the stuff. And this would be nothing other than a change in the form of exploitation. Now it's not the capitalist boss, but it's the people who just don't want to do any work and they let everybody else do the work. Okay, so as communism comes out of capitalist social relations, because alienation is still in the work, so consumption can't be on the basis of each according to ability, each according to need. Right? This is what Marx talks about in the Critique of the Gotha program as the higher stage. The higher stage of communism. It cannot be that as we come out of capitalist social relations. And this is a very deep kind of Marxist point, that the distribution, the way things are distributed in society is a function of how they're produced. Okay, that capitalists get filthy rich, right, and workers, struggle to pay their rent, is a function of the production relation, of the fact that one person owns the means of production and the other is working as a wage labourer for the others. And the distribution is an implication, it's downstream of the production relation. And so too in communism, as it emerges out of capitalism, the production relations are such that the distribution relations must be linked to one's contribution to social labour. And that to go to a based on need, where consumption and production, the link between consumption and your contribution to social labour is broken, well, that would require a change in what production is. That production itself, that all these alienated forms of production would have to be washed out of the system over time as a process. If work becomes enjoyable, who cares if I work 10 hours and you work 2 if we both consume the same? No one cares. And how should we organise production? Should we organise production? It's quite fashionable in the last few years to talk about how, well, we could plan in natural units. We should be planning in youth values, in number of cars, number of horses, number of atom bombs, the steel produce, the corn output. But is this possible? Well, let's talk about one of the good parts of capitalism from a cybernetic point of view. Okay, it's the self-organisation of production. If I am a firm and we are trying to figure out what we should do in this firm, we have this very simple heuristic we follow. If our sales are greater than our costs, keep going. That's brilliant. We're doing the right thing. If our sales are less than our costs, we're going to go bankrupt. We must be doing something wrong. We got to change what we're doing. This very, very simple heuristic allows firms in the economy to self-organise wherever they are. Now, when it comes to plan the economy in terms of natural units, is 2 barrels of oil better than 5 tons of wood? If you're in your firm, you say, which should we use? 2 barrels of oil or 5 tons of wood? Or should we use 3 kilograms of steel or 15 sheets of plywood? What's the right answer here? There's actually no heuristic you can use. People self-organising in the economy, they cannot know. They do not know what it is to produce 5 barrels of oil or 5 tons of wood in natural unit terms. So there's actually no heuristic. It's been 100 years since Neurath and Hilferding have come up with this idea of planning in kind in physical units. And yet no one has come up with a method that allows workers to self-organize production in natural units. And the reason why they haven't done it is not because they're not smart people looking at it. It's because it's actually impossible, right? It's an apples and oranges problem. It cannot be done in a self-organized way. You can plan using a central solver and a massive input-output matrix to plan a production, to give out a production plan, but not in a self-organized way. And with that central production plan, that has massive cybernetic problems that I can't get into here. That would have to be a whole other lecture. But safe to say, it cannot be done in a cybernetically valid way in natural units. It's an impossibility. And so the self-organization of production, it relies upon a single unit of account, a single heuristic metric that people can use to figure out, is technique A better than technique B? Is input A better than input B? In capitalism, it does this on monetary costs. In communism, it will do it on labour time. This is like a cybernetic necessity. There has to be a single metric that people can self-organise around. And what does labour time represent? It basically is a measure of how difficult something is to do. It's the measure of productivity. The less work it takes to do something, the better it is. Okay, so there's this deep relation between cybernetics, self-organizing of the economy, and value theory, labor time accounting, as the expression of kind of value theory in communism, if we want to put it in those pejorative terms. Here's what Marx said from the outline of the Critique of Political Economy. Ultimately, all economy is a matter of time. This is important whether you're a hunter-gatherer, whether you're a feudal, whether you're a capitalist. Ultimately, all are concerned with the matter of the economy of time. And so in the Critique of the Gotha Programme, where Marx gives his longest expression of his thoughts on socialism, and I would say it's talking about a socialist political economy. And here's what he says about linking production to consumption. Okay, one's contribution to social labour and one's ability to consume goods. A given amount of labour in one form is exchanged with an equal amount of labour in another form. I work for 6 hours, I get to consume goods that have on average 6 hours of labour contained in them. And this relation, this one-to-one relation between your production and your consumption, is an expression of egalitarian communist social relations. There's no exploitation involved here. I'm not working for 4 hours and getting only 2 hours like in capitalism. If I work for 4 hours, I get 4. Exploitation, is expunged from such a system where we have this exchange of equivalence. This is an egalitarian distribution relation, a fundamentally egalitarian distribution relation. And, it's fundamental, which we cannot get into here, but it's to link production to consumption is fundamentally linked to the process of how alienated labour is expunged from communism. That once everybody has to do some alienated labour, society will direct its resources towards eliminating those types of labour. So we see here that there's this kind of, social relations element to it, but also, the optimization of production element, where everybody has equal access to consumption, just like the equalizing of wages was necessary on the production line in the TPS to enhance productivity. So too in socialism as it comes out of capitalism. Because if we were to do otherwise, if we were to reward individual productivity, notwithstanding the problems of rewarding individual productivity for being a fetter on the mode of production, but if one was to reward individual productivity, we would have a stratification in society. We would be rewarding those with, natural endowments of intelligence or strength or whatever it is, or social intelligence, emotional intelligence. with a higher ability to consume than others. And so this is diametrically opposed to the concept of a classless society. Okay, so if we were to reward individual productivity, we would be baking in a class society. So we cannot do it as a matter of logical necessity. And what's interesting is we see in the communes, and as they randomly have appeared over the last 150 years, such as like as in Venezuela now we have the communes, that this idea of, in the communes, this idea of rewarding everybody's consumption at this exchange of equivalence emerges naturally out of cooperative social relations of production. It's an expression of what cooperative relations productions are. And we see this finding repeated again and again. We see it in the TPS. We see it in the work of Eric Trist, who found the same cooperative relations of production arising in his research into how miners were organizing production in these kind of proto-TPS ways in the 1940s, late 1940s, early 1950s. And also, a communist society also won't have money. So labour tokens are not money, even though they may look like a similar form. They have a different content. There's a different essence behind them. They represent a different social relation. A labour token is a recognition for your contribution to social labour, but it does not allow you to hire a worker. Why would a worker ever want to work in a communist society and receive less than 1 hour of consumption goods for their hour of labour? Why would they ever choose to get paid a half an hour worth of consumption for an hour's work? Labour tokens, they're not money. Money is intrinsically linked to the ability to hire people to work. Labour tokens are an actual expression of a change in the actual social relations of production. That society is planning its production together, a collectivized production, which abolishes wage labour, and with it money. Goods do not need to be expressed in dollars or pounds or euros or yen or rand or rupee or yuan. They are expressed directly in the amount of labour time it takes to produce. So we see that this is this kind of defetishization. We do not think that the value of the commodity is somehow intrinsic to its physical qualities, as is the case with money and capitalism. But we see actually the price of the good is actually directly linked to the amount of labour it contains, explicitly in those terms. There is no need for an obfuscation. And so all of this implies communal reproduction versus private reproduction. Instead of individual firms reproducing only themselves in competition, trying to siphon away surplus value from its competitors with its higher productivity. The associated producers of themselves reproduce themselves as a totality, not in antagonistic relations with each other, but in cooperative relations with each other. Not one firm on its own versus all its other competitor firms, but all shoe producers together reproducing themselves. And this gives us very fundamentally different dynamics in economic dynamics come out of communal reproduction. In capitalism, we have socially necessary labour time. In communist production, as the Group of International Communists called it, we have an average social production time. And these are the same essential measure, in some sense. It's the average amount of labour contained in the shoe. But in communism, there is no distribution towards the most efficient producers. There is no surplus going towards a capitalist firm that produces shoes more efficiently because they have newer machines than another firm. Both reproduce as a unit. That the price of the good is the average amount of labour contained in it, and that is sufficient to reproduce all of the shoe producers together. It's a fundamentally different economic process. So some people like to think, well, what you're just talking about with labour tokens is basically money, right? Marx was dumb, he just didn't realise what his whole scientific analysis was about. That in reality, labour tokens are just money. And it's not the case for Marx. Here's what he says about value and communism. The determination of value continues to prevail. He's talking here about in communism or socialism, in the sense that the regulation of labour time and the distribution of social labour among the various production groups, ultimately, the bookkeeping encompassing all of this becomes more essential than ever. So, to the extent that there is this calculation of labour time contained in use values, that aspect, and it's how we account for it in terms of labour time, which mimics how we account for goods in terms of money in capitalism. That, in that sense, value continues. But in the sense that value is this oppressive force that works behind the backs of both the employers and the labourers, forcing them production norms upon them, in that sense, that does not exist. Another fundamental thing is that in capitalism we have indirectly social labour, whereby the work is only validated post hoc as being valid social labour. But in communism, it's directly social. The work is immediately social. It does not require market exchange to be validated as social labour. You know, in capitalism, with exchange, when a goods exchange, within that exchange there is this, realization of surplus value, that it behind that exchange is a production relation based upon exploitation. With directly social labour, we work 1 hour, we have the ability to consume goods of 1 hour. Our labour is immediately valid. In communism, production is the production of use values for people's needs and wants, and not the production for profit. These are use values with prices in labour time. So let's have a look here. Here's a table. Its price is made up of the fixed, the circulating and the labour inputs. The fixed inputs, so the machines and the buildings, the circulating inputs, the raw materials that are renewed each time, and the living labour, okay, the work of the people. So mimicking Marx's value of a commodity equation, here we have price is equal to F plus C plus L, fixed plus circulating plus labour, each in terms of labour time. So for example, the value of this table will be 0.5 hours in, say, machinery, 1 hour in direct wood inputs, and 2 hours of labour inputs, and that'd be 3.5 hours in total. I don't have time here to deal with how to price naturally produced inputs. Okay, but safe to say that it's trivial, despite what an Austrian economist might tell you. Okay, and what's important to understand here is that when I go and exchange a labour token for this table, 3.5 hours of my labour that I performed represented in this token to get that table, that, this is not commodity exchange. There's no realization of surplus value going on here. When I, purchase the table, there is not an exploited worker behind that production process. This is not commodity exchange. These are use values with prices versus commodity production, which is production of goods for the aim of producing profit or surplus value. Fundamentally different transaction. That on the surface, this exchange looks the same, but in reality, there's a completely different social relation behind it. And that's what Marx critiqued about market exchange, not the transfer of goods between different, not people being able to, say, purchase a table in communism. It was that in capitalism, when you purchase that table, it is the realization of profit for a capitalist. Okay, and here we return now to the same little bit of text from the Complex Anarchism Symposium. So let's read again. Let's revisit this blurb from the Complex Anarchism Symposium and to see what we've discovered about the necessary basis for socialism and what science has to say. The sciences of cybernetics and value theory can tell us about the nature of socialism. Anarchy, despite its popular definition as a state of disorder, is rather a mode of being where we organise ourselves voluntarily, that is, without coercion from a central controller or hierarchical system. So let's just interrogate the words voluntarily here, because voluntary organisation and communal reproduction are in tension, they're in contradiction. So this is a very deep point. That if firms were able to reproduce outside of this communal reproduction, if more efficient producers were able to leave the communal reproduction system, and if they were able to produce a shoe, say, at 1.5 hours, and the average production time for all of the producers was 2 hours, if they were able to sell their shoe at 2 hours, they would make a profit. They would grab a surplus from the other producers. And thus we see that you cannot allow non-communal reproduction, as it is in direct contradiction with communist social relations. That voluntary organisation is not an absolute. That if we had the most efficient shoe producers decide to break off and to sell their shoes and thus gain a surplus from them, that we would reintroduce socially necessary labour time dynamics. For communist production to be a reality, for communist society to be a reality, it must be communal reproduction, and that this is not a voluntary association. Now, an anarchist might object to this and say, well, that's imposing and coercion. But I don't think any anarchist would not consider outlawing domestic violence or slavery as an unjustified coercion. And so too we must apply this also to voluntary organisation as an absolute. We need to think about communal reproduction in these terms. That communal reproduction is as fundamental as reducing exploitation, direct exploitation, slavery, violence and abuse and domination. That you cannot have this absolute notion of voluntary organisation. Voluntary organisation is not an absolute. So now so far I've had a couple of critiques of anarchist notions of socialism. Let's get over to the Marxists. And let's finally expose, this scientific illiteracy behind this concept of central planning. Central planning by its definition is a push system. We have orders from the centre telling everybody what to produce, particularly in its more, in the more modern imaginations of it, a la Cockshot or Take Your Pick, where with the detailed production plans that are issued by a centralised solver. Pull production has shown itself to be literally in order of magnitude. It's not an exaggeration to say something like that. In order of magnitude more efficient than a push production systems. And if communism is to be a valid mode of production, it's got to be more efficient, more productive than capitalist is. Just as capitalism was more efficient than feudalism, so too is communism has to be than capitalism. It has to pull down the fetters of capitalist production. And one of these is push. And central planning is unique. It's essentially just push production in its most obtuse form. And not just that, but it's hard to imagine anything more alienating than being handed production instructions from a centralised computer saying, produce this now, or don't produce that. Computer says no, do it like I say. And alienated labour is the essence of a class society like capitalism. And that means that central planning literally cannot logically be the basis of production in socialism, as a matter of scientific fact. So here we see, we mentioned earlier, saying Engels' socialism, his pamphlet, Socialism, Scientific and Utopian. The idea of detailed centralized production plans, by a central solver, is literally as utopian as the idea of socialism without hierarchy. It is as utopian. It's just a modern form of utopian socialism. Central planning is the Robert Owen, the Henri de Saint-Simon and the Charles Fourier of their day, with their plans in the skies. Except this time it's in the cloud. And we must really stress here that central planning is not a Marxist concept. I know I have this in I say this again and again, but Marx never ever mentions it. Never mentions it as in those terms. Never mentions central planning, central planners, anything to do with central planning. Right? It's just not a Marxist concept. As we said earlier, associated producers would collectively plan production. So Marx and Engels saw in the cartel, they described the cartel as already planning production. Where the steel producers, the steel cartel, where they planned all steel production, say, in a given state. That was for them already planned production, but it was in an antagonistic form. In one of these cartels, they would not be wasting investment into overcapacity because they had full knowledge of all state steel production in their nature, in their nation. So this was the sense in which they talked about planning, was that the associated producers would plan as if they were a cartel, but with different social rates of production. And secondly, the strategic planning that we mentioned earlier with this steam production, where production would now be done on a rational basis, where instead of going in and destroying each small town and developing it and ruining its river source, there would be strategic planning of where it would be best to put stuff, given, where the workers live and et cetera, and its effects on the environments. So let's look at what Stafford Beer, the cybernetician who came up with the VSM, has to say about planning. But planning is not an activity carried out by professionals called planners. Planning is not an activity resulting in products called plans. It is a continuous process. And this is fundamentally true. If we take the VSM seriously, that in each system it's got its own planning node, like in our body we've got our own brain functions and our eyes and our ears for planning, and so on and so forth in the great chain of being, that planning is actually carried out at all layers of recursion, and it must be carried out at all layers of recursion as a matter of scientific fact, that variety can only be attenuated by those with the requisite variety, and only those at their recursions have the requisite variety to plan that recursion. This is a fundamental implication of the cybernetic nature of reality. And there is not a single organism on the planet that has the equivalent of central planning. Not one. If it was so efficient, I'm sure evolution would have, by this stage, come up with a way of, it would have stumbled upon it as a solution. In Chile, Beer attempted to put, his ideas of planning into fruition. This is his idea to plan, cybernetically plan the newly nationalized Chilean economy in the 1970s. The Cybersyn was an amazing project, and it was destroyed before it ever really got up and going. But the thing is, it lacked a proper political economy. Beer was not a political economist. He did not understand the workings of capitalism. And, so Cybersyn in and of itself was one element of what we could imagine socialist society to be, the organizational principles. But it definitely would have ended up failing because it had not the correct social relations of production at its base. So finally, let's recap what kind of synthesis we've come to about the nature of socialism and anarchism and cybernetics and value theory. One is that hierarchy is inevitable in all types of viable systems. That alienation is the basis for capitalism, but it's also a fetter on capitalist production. That the highest performing firms consistently try to de-alienate labour as much as possible. And it's not just de-alienating the labour. Built into this de-alienation is cooperative relations of production. That we are essentially social beings. And that cooperative relations of production are an expression of this. That teamwork is what it is to be human. Furthermore, that egalitarian distribution relations are fundamentally linked to what is teamwork. Fundamentally linked to teamwork. Fundamentally linked to the optimization of production. And we have this very deep point in capitalism, that capitalism actually maximizes its production of value, right? Its production of profits by optimizing production as if it was producing just use values. This is a very kind of, in some senses it's obvious you should be trying to optimize, the use value production. But in some senses it's counterintuitive, because that is not how capitalism actually tries to control production. as a rule, it does so through cost measures. That's a whole new other lecture, another chapter of the book. And that labour time is necessary for the self-organisation of production. There is no natural unit heuristic available to us. And that production has to be self-organised, right? It can't be centralised. It has to be as a function of the cybernetic nature of reality. It has to be self-organised at the various recursions. And labour time is required to do this. It is the equivalent of cost, monetary cost in capitalism. And furthermore, there has to be a link between production and consumption in lower stage communism, because we have alienated labour built into our productive apparatus, our capitalist productive apparatus that we would inherit. And to rid ourselves of these alienated labour is a process that this would actually be a change in the production relations, which would thus allow a change in the distribution relations to be based just upon need. Also, communal reproduction cannot be voluntary, that it's in contradiction. Communal reproduction and voluntary organisation are in contradiction. And that central planning is utopian. It's non-scientific. It does not comport with the fundamental laws of the universe. And so here we see this common thread running through all of these links between value theory and cybernetics, and how, if we understand both of them, we can really understand what the nature of production and the nature of social relations must be. That these are not choices, these are a matter of scientific deduction. And with that, I will say thanks very much if you got this far. Now, please hit the like button. Please leave a comment, juice that algorithm. If you have a question, I plan on doing a questions and answers video for this. So if you have questions, you can hit me up on Patreon. You can hit me up on Blue Sky. Send me an email. You can leave a question in the comments. I read all your comments. I try and reply when I've got something meaningful to say. If you'd like to help support the show, I really can't do this without your help on Patreon. You can also donate at the book website, theclassesocietyofmotion.com. The book is going very well. Every little contribution helps. Spread the word. Until next time.